As Brian said, I am going to be talking about branching out with PGRs to wrap up today's session. And you've heard a little bit already about the importance of cultural practices. You've heard a lot about light this morning or today, and you heard about how that promotes branching. You've heard Brian talk about how your other cultural practices affect plant growth, which obviously affects branching. And then Brian also mentioned the ultimate in shearing with the weed trimmer. But we know that a lot of us use shearing or pinching to improve branching of our materials. But we know that moderate branching, the soft pinch will actually promote branching. But when you get into those really hard pinches, you'll kind of get a few leaders in the plant, harder branches instead of the branching that you want. But we also know that the pinching, the shearing also comes with high labor costs. So what we've been looking at a lot of this here in the floriculture, been looking at how we can use a chemical approach to branching. And our goal, of course, is just to improve the plant architecture, give you a nicer plant, more ready for sale. We're looking at it for a substitute for pinching. Again, pinching is very labor intensive, and as Brian mentioned, it also delays the growth of that plant, and the bloom takes it longer to bloom. But our goal is to release the dominance so that we can increase branching and improve the quality of these plants, and hopefully then finish those plants more quickly. Now in floriculture, we have 3 chemistries that we can work with in branching. The first one I'll mention is e-GRO, and this is an OH product. It's dikegulac sodium. It works as a, basically damages the cells in the terminal so that it enhances the branching, releases apical dominance. Configure is the benzoadenine product from Fine Americas, and this one is, the BA itself has been around for a long time, used on Christmas cactus and hosta, but we found a lot of other uses for it since it has been labeled for floricultural crops. And then Ethifon is another one that's been around for a very long time. You're probably familiar with Florel. And then recently, Fine Americas has come out with a more concentrated version of Ethifon in cholate. So we're going to talk about how these are working in floriculture, with particularly with emphasis on perennials. As you probably know, that's where my focus is. So let's talk about Configure to start with. Configure's been out a little longer. It came out in 2008 with a lot of emphasis on the crops that we used before, like the Christmas cactus and hosta. But we also started looking at perennials and some of the other crops that may be particularly responsive to Configure, and we found that Echinacea was one in particular. So some of the early work, we were working with some pretty high rates, 900 parts per million, gave us excellent branching of Magnus. Some lower rates go down to 600, sometimes 300 parts per million will give us an increase in branching. And we're talking about basal branching, ones that actually do give us an improvement in pot fill is what we're looking for. And typically we're seeing a doubling of the branches. Now there have been a lot of people other than me working with Echinacea and looking for branching on those, and we're typically finding most of the cultivars are very responsive to Configure, with either a doubling or sometimes a tripling or more of the number of basal branches. Not affecting flowering yet, we're not getting that premature flowering down, but you can see we are getting an improvement in the basal branches on these plants. But we started looking at what some other perennials would respond, how they would respond to Configure. And one of the early ones we looked at was Gaillardia, and we found a huge response to 600 parts per million Configure. But what we did find is that this crop also had an interruption in flowering. Essentially, the plant would delay flowering for about a month, and we found this with several different cultivars of Gaillardia. So we're no longer recommending it. You may have seen this picture before. I just want to make sure you know we're no longer recommending Configure for Gaillardia. But we do have a lot of perennials that have been very responsive without any issues in flowering. Lobelia is a very excellent one. And as I mentioned, one of our goals is to finish the plants more quickly. And what we can see with Lobelia is that even at 4 weeks, there's a significant improvement in pot fill with these 13 branches on our Configure treated plants. Now 600 parts per million is the rate that we use as a screening rate, and these were typically applied about 2 weeks after, let's say 7 to 14 days after transplanting liners, and this was basically once they were established in the pot and actively growing. But we've done a lot of work, I'll show you a little bit later here, on timing of these applications. applications. But most of these pictures are with liners transplanted and treated about 7 to 10 days later. This is lobelia at 6 weeks after, and you can see just the number of new basal branches that we have coming up in that plant. And sometimes we see a crop like Configure where we see an increase. We can count an increase and we see an improvement. A crop like e-GRO, where we can see an increase in the number of basal branches, but the numbers aren't that great. And this was probably even a little more so with Penstemon, Husker Red. We had only, when we counted them, only 2 more basal branches at 7 weeks after treatment. But you can see that the appearance of these plants are significantly better than the untreated controls. So we're getting an improvement with branching with a lot of our herbaceous perennials with treatment with Configure, and we are getting faster pot fill. There are a few that kind of stand out as what I call superstars. Angora Siskiyou Pink is one of those. We actually saw an increase in the number of shoots per pot. You see that significant number of shoots, which had an increased number of breaks on the shoots and an increased number of flowers. So there are a few superstars out there. Echinacea, Angora are a couple of those, but we're seeing an increase in a lot of different crops that are less responsive to a lot of our other cultural means. One of those is Phlox paniculata. This is 600 parts per million Configure. We had an increase in branching on this plant. This is more lateral branching, not your basal branching, but you can see we had an increase in number of laterals, an increase in number of flowers, and no delay in flowering. Echinacea is another one that we looked at with Agio. Agio has been around a little less time, so we have a few fewer examples with it. But you can see that we did get an increase in basal branching with Agio with these higher rates, 800 and the 1600 parts per million. But we did see fewer flowers when we got up to the 1600 parts per million. But also we saw Agio increase the lateral branching on Phlox paniculata. But again, we had to get up into the 1600 parts per million to get a good increase. And we did basically double the number of branches there. One of the things that we've seen, I mentioned we were interested in earlier pot fill. And so we decided to look at a study. This was actually done by an undergraduate research student, Margaret Aiken, and Margaret is now back as our lab technician. And she looked at the time that she applied the Configure, 600 parts per million Configure, to Echinacea white Swan. And basically she had no application, which of course is our control. Then she applied it at the time of transplanting the liners, or 1 week after planting, 2 weeks after planting, or 3 weeks after planting. And this picture here is taken at 4 weeks after planting. Now we'll mention at 8 weeks, if the crop finished, there was no difference in the Configure treatments. Regardless of what time we applied them, they had basically 8 new branches where our controls had basically 1 or 2. So we had an improvement with all of the treatments, but the earlier pot fill is what you can see here. At 4 weeks after transplant, we have 5.5 branches on those that were treated 1 week after planting. So the earlier we make these treatments, the better that we may see these responses. And this basically led up to a study that Mara Grossman did as part of her master's degree. What if we did earlier applications? So what we looked at with Mara's study was using unrooted cuttings, actually starting to make these applications in the propagation phase. And she used basically unrooted cuttings stuck in 72s. They were rooted under mist. Once the roots were visible, they were removed from mist, and basically the treatments were applied at that time. And here is one of the examples. Basically, the roots are visible on all 4 sides of the liner, but it is not complete. It's not an intact liner yet. We used different treatments in different studies. Not all of these were applied in any one study. The treatments were actually applied to a 6-pack of liners. And the 6-packs may have contained 2 or all the way up to 6 actual plants in that 6-pack. So you can see that we used both all of these different chemistries that we mentioned in different studies. We used a variety of crops, and now Mara has published a good bit of this work, and that information is certainly available to you if you want to drop me an email. But we've worked at a lot of different crops, and I'm going to show you a few of those examples here. This is Configure. I mentioned that GAR was very responsive to Configure, and we did see, just as we saw in the earlier study with liners that were transplanted and finished into finished plants, if we applied the Configure in the liner stage, we got an increase in the number of branches and the number of leaders. And what we found with this crop is if we transplanted those liners into the finished pot, in this case a quart pot, and grew them out. This is 8 weeks after initial treatment, basically growing them out another 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the crop. We found that we still had an increase with all of our configured treatments in the number of branches and the number of leaders. Now, we don't find that with all of the crops, and I'm going to show you that. But what we found, what we're looking for, is a combination of crop and treatment, PGR, that will actually what we call increase the capacity of the plant, which means that we're actually increasing the plant's ability to branch, giving it more branches than it would normally have under good growing conditions. And that's what we found with Configure on GAR. Now, another example here is Configure on Alaskan Daisy. You can see that we had an increase in the number of branches, but we did have a reduction in root weight. This reduction in root weight with Configure did not reduce the grow out of the plants. However, we did not continue to see an increase in the number of branches in those plants either. So we have plants like GAR, we were increase the capacity. We have plants like the Canthmum where we have a very short-term effect. And potentially, we can increase that effect by making multiple applications. Lavender was another example where we had an increase in the branching of the finished liners. This is 4 weeks after treatment. We actually had an increase in branches, leaders, and the shoot dry weight. So we basically had nice liners. We're increasing the quality of the finished liners. In this case, we also had a carryover effect. We had an increase in the capacity of the plants, where at 8 weeks after treatment, we still had an increase in the number of branches, and with the 300 times 2, we actually had an increase in the number of leaders as well. So this was the kind of response we're looking for. We also tested Configure on Veronica Goodness Grows. The finished liners, we had an increase in branches. Basically, you can see we went from basically 2 up to 9 branches. And again, so these branches are in the lower part of the plant. This is really where we want to see those in case we still want to come back and trim off the top for shipping or handling. Our branches, our improvement is in the base of the liner, where we'll get and where we'll see that response in the grow out of the plants. In that case, we did with Veronica and Goodness Grows. We've also tested Agio and Florel on Veronica Goodness Grows, and you can see that both of those also increase the number of branches. The 1,600 parts per million Agio, you can see, resulted in a lot of stunting, but you can see the significant increase in branches with all of these treatments. When we grow these plants out, again, this is 8 weeks after the original treatment, you can see that 1,600 parts per million Agio was just too much. A lot of growth regulation with 800, excellent looking plant with 400 parts per million, good branching, good growth control. And our Florel treatment still had an increase in branching. Again, these we may want to trim back earlier in the liner stage, and that will give us probably a better finished plant. But you can see we do have to worry about stunting with the higher rates, especially of Agio. Verbena, this is Benariensis lollipop. We also looked at Agio and Florel. And again, Agio increased branching. You can see the kind of growth control that we got. And we got just a little bit of twisted leaves in these liners, but they grew out of that quite nice. One thing I wanted to point out was we went from basically one branch on our control liners here to about 5 on our Florel. We had better increases than that with Agio. But when we grew these plants out, we still had an increase in branching with the 800 and the 1,600 parts per million of Agio. You can see we have a little bit of delay in flowering with these, and basically those branches are in the lower part of the plant, so it gives you a fuller looking pot. But what was interesting was our Florel treatment, we actually had a decrease in the number of branches. Compared to our control, which had 28 branches, our Florel treated finished plant only had 18, which was a little bit surprising to us, and we haven't gone back to repeat that. So again, take it with a grain of salt. But we've also looked at Agio on Phlox paniculata, and what we did with these studies, and again, this is some of Mary Grossman's work, we looked at making one application in the liner stage right after they came off of mist, and comparing that to one application made just after transplanting into their final container. Then we also looked at a combination of those two treatments. So we had treated at liner, we had treated at transplant, and we had treated at both times. And looking at the finished liners, which only treated once, of course, we had an increase in the number of branches and an increase in the shoot dry weight, particularly with the decrease in shoot dry weight with our 1,600 parts per million. We had some height control, which that's good. But we found that with the single treatments, whether it's treated at liner stage or at transplant, there was no effect on the finished plants. But when we used two treatments, we actually stunted those plants. So this was treated twice with Agio at 400, 800, 1,600 parts per million. Only the 1,600 part per million treatment gave us a significant increase in the number of branches, but as you can see, the stunting was significant as well. So that was not an acceptable treatment. Compare that to Configure, and again, crops have their preferences as far as what they're going to respond to. When we looked at the liners, this was in the same study with Bright Eyes, we had an increase in the branching and we had an increase in the shoot dry weight in our finished liners with 600 parts per million Configure. But that one treatment, only at the liner stage, did not give us an improvement in the finished plants at 8 weeks after treatment. However, if we treated them twice at the liner stage and then again about 2 or 3 days after transplanting, we had a significant increase in the number of branches with our 600 parts per million Configure. So the idea of using two treatments is what we're basically leaning toward and recommending for most growers now. Sedum Autumn Joy is almost a better example of this. We did see that Configure increased the branching of the liners. This is 3 weeks after treatment. The finished plants that were treated one time at the liner stage did not have any significant improvement at the end of the finishing. But if they were treated twice, this is get that out of the way. This is the treatment at liner stage only. You can see we had no improvement in the number of branches, but if they were treated twice, once at the liner stage and once a few days after transplanting, we saw a significant increase, basically 2.5 times the number of branches on this plant. Now, one of the other things that we saw with Agio was a little bit of yellowing, so you're going to have to pay attention to that as far as timing of your applications and giving these plants time to grow out. So this was Agio on the first three here, 400, 800, and 1,600 Agio on sedum, the liners. We still had a huge increase in the number of branches, just like with Configure, but we did have a reduction in height and shoot dry weight. But the single treatment, again, whether it was applied at the liner stage or just after transplant, had no effect on the finished plants. However, two applications gave us a 200% increase in the number of branches, and we still had some reduction in growth, which may not be bad with our 800. Or 1,600 is definitely too much reduction in growth. But you could tell, hopefully you can tell a little bit here, a little bit of yellowing in these plants. They would need just a little more time to get over that. Yellowing is a fairly typical phytotoxicity response that we see with Agio, but it basically is just, it's a transient effect, and if you give the plants a little more time, they will grow on out of that. And again, I showed you the Configure here that was treated twice. Sorry about that. All right. We've done a little more work with Colate, since it's a fairly new product out now. And we looked this summer with liner dips on Veronica First Love. And we actually did not see any increase in branching with the liner dips or the foliar spray with Colate. But this was at 2 weeks after treatment. We did do a pinch comparison, and we did see an increase in the branching on that. But let's look at these finished plants. Again, the The liners were finished in 2 weeks, a very rapidly growing crop. So I don't think we'd seen the full effect of the ethifon, the cholate at that time, because with finished plants, 8 weeks after that treatment, we actually had an increase in both the number of leaders and the branches with all of our cholate treatments. And our pinched plant had the same number of branches as our cholate treated plants, but it did have fewer leaders than our cholate treated plants did. We also found that the cholate tended to decrease the number of days to flower, which is not really what we expect with ethifon, but that's what we found with the Veronica First Love. Now, let me get rid of this. I did want to point out some phytotoxicity on liners. I didn't mention them on here. I didn't show you any pictures, but we did find a few crops in our screening that were very sensitive to these PGRs. For example, for Configure, you do not want to use Configure on aster. We used 2 or 3 different cultivars and seen this excessive tip burning, so you don't want to do that. We also found distorted leaves on Cosmos, and that was not only at the liner stage, but that was something that actually persisted into the finished plant stage. So those are 2 that we would take off the list for Configure, and mention Gaillardia as well. You don't want to use Configure on Gaillardia. Agio, we had some distortion with verbena, with the Bonariensis, but those plants did grow out normally. So if you're doing your own liners, or if you have someone who trusts you, then that would do fine. And again, on sedum, we had some yellowing, but those plants, again, given more time, would grow out of that. With the cholate and Florel, we did not identify any phyto under our conditions. Again, you do want to use moderate application conditions for that. We'll go over that just a little bit on keys to use, but we haven't seen any specific crops that had a problem with that. So let's just summarize branching agents on liners. Basically, these branching agents are improving branching during liner production. We do recommend that you apply them after rooting. We found a little bit of phyto with earlier application. The plants just seem to be a little bit too soft. We found some moderate decreases in root growth, but in no case has that affected the quality of the finished plant. And we have seen some phytotoxicity. I just showed you a couple of those. And one of the things we've seen with a lot of these is there's short-term activity in some crops. We'll see a significant response after 2 weeks, and it's gone at 4. So that does indicate a value in reapplying these branching agents in a lot of these crops. We also recommend making a second application shortly after transplanting, and these be very careful with ethifon. Again, most of these comments I've made are referring to the perennials that we've used, and a lot of you know the effects that ethifon has on flowering of your annual crops or your vegetative annuals. So be very careful on the timing of that. And for more information on some of Mara's work, some of the other crops that we've looked at, you can visit our website. Under the presentations, you'll see quite a few of the presentations we or Mara have done for our work. So let me just go through some keys to use them for these different products. Configure is a short-term activity, so you want to be aware that it stimulates, but it does not cause branching or flowering. So you have to look for those windows of opportunity, and that's another reason to look at these multiple applications. All right. You want to make sure you're applying it at active growth, when the plant is in active growth, and you want to make sure you leave at least 2 weeks between those multiple applications. We have seen some issues of phyto if we get a little bit get that time period down too short. But in a lot of these cases, a lot of the perennials in particular, we've seen a definite improvement with 2 applications as opposed to 1. Be sure that you get complete spray coverage that's not actively transported through the plant, so you want to make sure you get good coverage. Agio, you do need to apply that early in the crop cycle. It will stimulate branching, but you need to leave ample time for the new growth to cover any yellowing or leaf necrosis that may occur. If you have any experience with Atromec, I will tell you that the new formulation, the carrier and everything with Agio is a lot safer. You'll have a lot less of an issue with Agio than you ever had with Atromec as far as your phyto. But again, make sure you're applying it to actively growing plants and the plants are stress-free which should be with all of your PGR applications. And again, make sure you're applying sufficient volume to wet the foliage. Again, recommending the 2 quarts per 100 square feet, just like the other PGRs. Ethifon can be a very cost-effective method of controlling growth and increasing branching. Be sure that you acidify that solution to a final pH of somewhere between 4 and 5. Don't let it get above 5. And if you can allow that solution to dry slowly over a period of about 4 hours, that will really enhance the uptake and enhance your response. We've been doing a good bit of work with drenches and liner dip applications with cholate, and this should give you a lot of different new options for using Ethifon. We're seeing some good activity there. You do have to manage the timing of your Ethifon treatments, and if you've worked with chlorella at all in the past, you know this. You need to avoid any flower delay, but the species and the cultivars vary significantly. So you're really going to have to conduct your own rate trials, and we really recommend that for all of the PGRs. It really interacts, excuse me. The PGR response to PGRs interacts with how you're growing, all of your growing conditions, and your application methods. So do your own rate trials. Brian mentioned the PGR guides that Fine Americas has sponsored, and this is the one that Brian mentioned on the annuals. It was published early last year, and then this is the new one that's coming out on perennials here in January with Grower Talks. And again, you'll find these posted on the Fine Americas website. You'll find those rate recommendations as best we can find them. In the annuals guide that Brian does is primarily labeled rates. There's just a lot more labeled rates out there. For the perennials, we don't have a lot of label rates. So basically, this is a research guide. So it's research guides or cultural recommendations from some of the companies, or sometimes actually grower experience and some reports that some of the growers have done. So for more information on our trials, we would love to have you contact us. My email is here, phone number, and our website. We post a lot of our publications and our presentations on the Floriculture website. That's at www.vt.edu/floriculture. And Brian, I would be happy to answer any questions. I'll leave that up for just a second. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them.